Hello, this is Mr. Langhorst with you for our next section of notes in Unit 2. This one's entitled Road to Lexington. So we're going to talk a little bit about how this is going to begin to move from just some protest about taxation to actual military action between the British and the colonists. So when we last left off, we talked about the Boston Tea Party. And of course, the British are not going to go without punishing this act. This is a pretty big act. About $1.7 million worth of today's tea was destroyed. So the British are going to have some laws to punish specifically Massachusetts because this happened in Boston. And then it's also going to have some repercussions for the other colonies. And this is called the Intolerable Acts. There's a bunch of different punishments. Probably one of the biggest punishments is that the Boston Harbor is going to be closed until they pay for the amount of tea that was damaged. And this is happening in 1774, just so we can kind of remember where we're at time-wise. Now, while this is happening, there's also kind of this movement throughout the colonies to begin to prepare just in case there's going to be any kind of military action needed. And so one term that we'll need to know is militia. So a militia is any type of volunteer army that essentially is pledged to, at some point, defend their community only if it's necessary. So this isn't necessarily a standing army. This just means that people are kind of getting organized. They kind of know how many people would be willing to fight, but it's not necessarily an army at this point. Another term that comes up during this time period is Minutemen. So essentially, militia and Minutemen are kind of interchangeable to a certain degree. Minutemen is kind of the term given to the militia that could be ready to go on a minute's warning, hence the name Minutemen. And again, it's important to note that these are volunteers. These are people that are farmers, blacksmiths, lawyers, printers, teachers. They are not professional trained soldiers, but they are ready to go if they're needed to defend their community. So in the fall of 1774, a very significant event happens, the First Continental Congress. So you have delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies. There's only one colony that is not there. I'm going to leave a little Easter egg here. If you can email me the one colony that does not go to the First Continental Congress, I will give you a little prize. But 12 of the 13 do attend, and one of the most important things they do is they decide to ban all trade with England until the Intolerable Acts are repealed. So they've tried this before with protesting, with taxes and things. They're now going to kind of throw their weight into this and say, we are not going to do any trade with England unless you do away with the Intolerable Acts. Now, the reason why this is important is because, remember, the Intolerable Acts are largely an action against Massachusetts, okay? But what's happening is now all the other states are essentially getting together and saying, we are going to now stand behind Massachusetts and we're going to support them, and we're beginning to act as one specific group, not 13 different colonies. And so this is in a lot of ways going to kind of start to plant that seed that the 13 colonies are a united group and they're not just 13 separate colonies. They also decide to start getting some type of training for the local militias. So again, we don't have an army here. We don't have a standing group of people that are fighting, but we're starting to kind of organize a little bit so we know if something happens, kind of what type of militia we have and just a little bit of possible training. So the First Continental Congress is really kind of establishing the seed for what will eventually become our united group of colonies. So most colonists thought that if there was a war with Britain, if it was something that was going to happen, it would be relatively short. A lot of people, if you'd have asked them in this time period, kind of the early 1770s, a lot of people think that if the colonies just kind of stood up for themselves, that Parliament would probably decide to change its policies, maybe give in and give them representation on taxation, for example. So a lot of people think that it's kind of just about kind of puffing out your chest and making England realize that they are going to stand up for themselves, but that there's probably not going to be a war. That's kind of the general public opinion. Now, we'll talk about spies and do a couple activities in class, but it is important to note that there are spies essentially happening on both sides. Sam Adams builds a spy network to watch the British troop movement, so we know if the British are moving troops around to different parts of New England and Massachusetts, for example. And Sam Adams, again, is one of those Sons of Liberty that is really kind of organizing a lot of this stuff. The British hear that the Americans are beginning to stockpile guns and supplies in Concord, Massachusetts, which is a small town just a little bit outside of Boston. They also would like to, the British would like to, arrest Sam Adams and John Hancock for their actions with the Sons of Liberty if they're able to apprehend them. And they've heard that Adams and Hancock were kind of semi-hiding out in nearby Lexington. So Lexington and Concord are two cities that are kind of outside, or two towns actually, outside of Boston. So on April 19th, 1775, the British troops move out of Boston, and they decide that they're going to go to the town of Lexington to try and catch and arrest Hancock and Adams. And then they want to march on to the city, or the town, town of Concord, and destroy the supplies there, things like gunpowder, ammunition, stuff like that. Now, Paul Revere and the Sons of Liberty have devised a warning system using different lanterns and different things within Boston to notify people on the small towns around Boston if the British troops would be on the move, and if they are on the move, if they're moving by land or if they're moving by sea. It's going to take different amounts of time getting out of Boston, depending on which route they take. So to give you an idea of what we're talking about here, this is Boston. Definitely look at the scale here. So this is 4 miles, all right? And so we're talking about going up this road. Lexington is here, and Concord is here. So the plan is the British are going to march up here pretty much in the dead of night. They're going to hopefully surprise Adams and Hancock in Lexington, arrest them, then march to Concord, destroy the gunpowder and stuff they have stored there, and then come back to Boston. That's at least the plan. So this is when the famous midnight ride takes place. Now, it's not just Paul Revere. It's actually several different people that go out and kind of let people know that the British troops are on the move. We've kind of commonly heard that he yelled, "The British are coming, the British are coming." But in reality, since everybody at this time period considers themselves to be British, he probably yelled something more like, "The regulars are out," or "The British Army is on the move," instead of "The British are coming." That would be a little bit confusing since everybody considered themselves to be British for the most part at this time period. Now, the Minutemen are waiting for the British in Lexington once they arrive on the green, kind of the big open area in the middle of their town. So as morning breaks, they're waiting there. The British meet up. They decide not to just continue to march by, but they kind of have a little show of force. The British tell the militia to drop their weapons and disperse, and they do not. Now, we're not exactly sure who fires the first shot. It's kind of a big history mystery there. But we know that once shots begin to be exchanged, at the end of the exchange of gunfire, 8 colonial militiamen are dead on the Lexington Square. And from that point on, the British decide to march to Concord, hopefully to get the ammunition there. They find when they get to Concord that the ammunition's already been moved. That's the purpose of Paul Revere and people letting them know that they're coming. And in the meantime, you have about 4,000 different militiamen from a bunch of different small towns around Boston beginning to assemble, and they're going to essentially kind of surround the roads that are going to go back to Boston. So as the British march back to Boston through Lexington again, they're going to find out that there's going to be a lot of militiamen picking them off. They're hiding behind trees or hiding behind different walls and stuff surrounding the road, and it's going to be a lot of British casualties as they march back. Now, this is a drawing of what it kind of looked like there on Lexington Green. The colonial militiamen, as I just mentioned, chased the British back to Boston, and at this time period, this is really the beginning of the Revolutionary War. There's really kind of no way to go back at this point. There's been gunfire exchange from the militiamen and the British regulars. So after all the protests and things happening in Boston, like the Boston Tea Party and Boston Massacre, now at this point, we are officially at the stage where a war is going to take place. So the Revolutionary War has begun, and we will pick up with our next section of notes. After looking at this map, I guess we'll go through this here first. So this is kind of interesting. This is the timeline for when people hear about the action at Lexington. It's commonly referred to as the shot heard around the world because everybody around the world begins to have an interest in this because this is the colonies in America going up against essentially what's the most powerful country in the world at this time. But it's interesting to see that it happens on April 19th. New York hears about it 4 days later on April 24th. It takes about another day to get to Philadelphia. It takes until April 28th to get to Williamsburg. And King George does not hear about it back in London until May 28th. So it takes place on April 19th, and King George doesn't hear about it until May 28th. That's pretty incredible. So we've got two groups now. We've got patriots. The patriots are people in the colonies that are loyal to the cause of American independence. And we have loyalists, people that are loyal to the British crown, colonists that want to remain British, and they essentially fight against American independence. We also have quite a few people that are neutral, and so it's important to note that not everybody's a loyalist or a patriot. We have some people that are neutral. We also have people that kind of bounce back and forth between loyalists and patriots during the war as well. So that is the end of our notes on the road to Lexington, and we're going to find out a little bit more about how the war begins after Lexington in our next section of notes. All right, thanks guys.